Hello, everyone. And I'm sorry, we are running a little late, so I'll try to wrap this up in time so people can go over to the next session. I'm going to change tactics a little bit and talk a little bit more from the platform point of view. So I work at Stanford University, and my team is responsible for building and managing Stanford's clinical data warehouse. So Stanford has a couple of different hospitals. It has an adult hospital, which is known as Stanford Healthcare, and a children's hospital, better known as Lucile Packard Children's Hospital. So the clinical data warehouse receives data from both the hospitals, and the data warehouse also has data from your biobank, other large-scale data studies that are happening at Stanford. So it's one clinical data warehouse for the entire Stanford. And traditionally, what my group has done is we have given data away to our researchers. So we have basically given them the research data cut that they have requested, and they go with the data, they go to the analytical platform of their choice, they analyze the data. Now the data is becoming big enough for us, so it's reached petabyte scale, and in 2 to 3 years' time, it's expected to reach tens of petabyte scale, and this is mostly coming from the imaging data and the genomics data. And at this point, basically making copies of this data and giving it away to researchers does not really make sense. So what we are doing is working on a platform that expands the concept of bringing compute to data and is basically building a platform that brings scientists to data. So I hope to give you, in some slides, a very quick overview of what we are trying to do. So the focus that we have is, can we do bigger data exploration? Can we do faster analysis? And can we do cheaper hypothesis testing? And we are taking a system of engineering approach to this, solving this bigger, faster, cheaper. And there are multiple aspects to this, and I'll just focus on a few of them. So one is just the data itself. And one of the things we talk about, when we talk about data, we talk about fair principles for the data. So the fair comes from the findable. If you can't find your data, you can't really do much with it. Accessible to the researchers, interoperable and reusable data. The interoperability is actually connected to what other people in other universities are doing with their data, because there are many diseases where you don't have sufficient data in a single hospital. So what you're trying to do is doing a distributed analysis across different sites without sharing the data. So that's where the interoperability comes in, and then you layer a privacy-protecting method of analysis across these data sets. So that's the second point in here. And this is in its very nascent stages. There are some really exciting work that researchers are doing, but these methods are by and large not largely available to the community. Then, of course, there is research ethics and compliance, that this governs all of the research that happens. And then there are secure workspaces, because as you start gathering imaging data and genomics data, these data sets become very hard to de-identify fully. So there is always that HIPAA layer on top of your data. So I'll briefly go over what the ethics and compliance is, because I realize this is a mixed group. So ethics and compliance actually govern how research takes place in United States. And one of the last cases, sad cases, was death of a teenager in a gene therapy experiment back in 1999. And that's when there was a very large-scale investigation that found that while most universities are working very hard to do their compliance processes correctly, it's actually a fairly cumbersome process, because there are hundreds to thousands of research studies that are going on. And staying on top of this requires you to have a shared responsibility model across the entire research institutes. And bad things happen when we don't follow these compliance guidelines, and these are some of the very recent articles that came out between August and November, showing what some of the bad impact of not following ethics and compliance. Privacy is also a fairly hard problem, and in this one I'm giving you an example that was shown in 2006 with census data. So census demographic data. If all you know is the gender, 5-digit zip code, and the date of birth, you can actually identify the individual with 63% probability. But that probability falls down to 0.2% if you only know the county and the month and date of birth. So many studies have painstakingly shown that privacy leak depends on the data that you have, the type of the data that you have, the population that you're dealing with, the workflow that's associated with the data. So making data sets public, open data, while is an excellent concept, is not really easily implementable in biomedical data because it's your data and it's my data. And these are things you don't know what the consequence of that would be when you share that more publicly. There is a significant body of work right now, which is mostly happening in the mathematics and CS community, that is looking at different mechanisms of privacy-preserving data sharing. So you don't really share the data, you really share the data analytics. And these are mostly in paper stages right now. Algorithms are being written, but these are not really available in kind of more broadly available tools. So my hope is that in time, these tools will be open source, these will be available as services on public clouds, and it will be more generally acceptable for users to actually use these algorithms directly without sharing the data. So why do we do all this hard work? And that's because biomedical data analysis can have some really brilliant impact. So I'm going to show you some scattering of studies in the last 2 to 3 months that has happened at Stanford using biomedical data. So one of them is, this is a very recent publication that came out at a conference where researchers showed that just using the electronic health record data, you could actually tell which patient need palliative care. And palliative care is an important problem for hospital systems because 60% of death happens in acute care. As of last known measure, 67% of hospitals have palliative care teams, but only 50% of people who need palliative care get care. And the reason for that is without doing a detailed chart review where the palliative care team looks at the medical history of each patient, it's very hard to tell who needs the care. And it's usually left to the doctor who's seeing the patient. So having a model gives you a very objective operational metrics to actually run this in a hospital setting. And this is one of the first models that have come out in this field, and we'll see more and more of these being actually used in operational settings. The other one is use of genomics in diagnosis. Many hospitals are launching their programs. Stanford has launched one, and one of the challenges we had there was basically building a solution that was better than outsourcing. And one of the advantages of Stanford is that it's an excellent research facility, particularly in the field of genomics. It's actually one of the top 2 medical centers in the world in genomics. So one of our challenge was to build a solution that would actually take advantage of the research that happens at Stanford and then make it available in the hospital setting. So we built a pipeline, which took some time to build because we were in pilot in 2014, that enabled experimentation to productization in a very seamless fashion. So it's built on standards, it's built on modern cloud technologies, it's built on modern containerization methods, and it allows for a rapid turnaround from research lab to clinic in about an year, which is blindingly fast in this space. Earlier this year, I was part of a research project where 40 people were hooked up with multiple different wearables, and for each individual, they measured about 250,000 variables. And NIH director basically at the, this was a viral paper. NIH director basically wrote that this is something that will happen in the future. And a few days ago, we saw launch of this Apple Heart study where they are partnering with Stanford and a couple of other organizations to check irregular heartbeat for individuals. So something that requires a serious medical procedure intervention in the hospital, now you can do it with just using your watch. So I would say the future is here. This is an extremely fast-moving field of science, and it's really exciting to see this in operation. Another one is imaging. Some of you recognize the names here. Andrew Ng is, of course, one of the gods of machine learning. He partnered with one of the radiologists at Stanford, and they built these deep learning models and showed that, at least in some cases, combining algorithms with radiologists is actually going to be better than radiologists. So these things are coming. This is going to happen, and it's an exciting time to be doing this type of research, gathering all of these kind of data sets, and then bringing that back to research for further advancement. The impact is big. I mean, when you are at Stanford, when you're in Bay Area, you live in a bubble, things are very easily accessible to you, but when you go in different parts of the world, it's not as accessible. So this is one study that Google did in coordination with multiple other researchers, and one of the participating organizations was Arvind Eye Care System. So in India, there are about 70 million diabetic patients, and 30% of them develop diabetic retinopathy. And access to doctors is actually not that trivial in India as it is in the US. And this particular eye care system is now piloting deployment in India in the clinics. So this is the kind of impact we want to be able to make with the kind of analysis that's happening on biomedical data. So when we now think about this building a system integration approach, I at least have taken my cues from some of the other giants who are doing similar things. And one of them is NIH. NIH has launched multiple of these, what they call data commons-like approach. This is part of their big data to knowledge studies, where they are actually looking into how biomedical data can benefit from being on cloud and then developing this ecosystem around the data. So you want to do the same, the FAIR principles, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And that brings in your tools. You have secure workspaces for researchers, and then you layer the compliance layer on top. So this year, very recently, about a month ago, they gave out 12 awards to basically build an NIH pilot phase consortium. And there is a vision to do this kind of a multi-cloud deployment of data commons. So now think about all the analytics that platforms like H2O is building. Think about your distributed data, and then being able to do distributed analysis on all the data on different clouds that go through the compliance process of different institutes, different organizations. Hospitals have their own, universities have their own, NIH has their own. So we are finally building models that are allowing us to do this at very large scale, and I'm excited to be part of building this at Stanford. The other organization I have looked up at who have done this excellently is Sage Bionetworks, and I'm actually not affiliated with Sage. They have a partnership model for open research where they allow the data to be shared not only with your institute's researchers, but across anybody. So if you are a researcher, and most of you are data science researchers, you can go to their website, you can sign up, you can actually look at biomedical data and do analysis on that data. And this is extremely unique because even at Stanford, we do not allow this type of open research on our data. But this is the model I'm aspiring to build, and I'm hoping that in time we'll figure out how to do this at Stanford. The other is, how do you do analysis on data without sharing the data? So this you can understand in the context of the containerized deployment of tools. So this is something that has been in, it's like Kaggle-like research. So you do something like Kaggle, except you don't share data. You ask researchers to submit their analysis methods in containers, and then you launch those on your data sets, and then you publish the results, very similar to how Kaggle does. The only difference is there is no data sharing. So there is example proof of concept of how people have done this. Maybe they are not at scale, but this is exactly the kind of models we are trying to scale up at Stanford level. So Stanford approach, we are building this clinical data warehouse that takes data from all different types, puts it in an interoperable framework where the language I speak is the same language another academic center will speak, as the same language as a pharmaceutical company will speak, so that we can run the same distributed analysis at all sites, and then making the data available to the researchers. Then there's this concept of building these secure workspaces. And this, if you're familiar with HIPAA, you'll know how difficult this is. And in the past, the approach we had taken was we had de-identified the data, given it to our researchers, and that was simple enough because the data was mostly structured data, some notes. Now we have gone imaging, we have genomics data, which is impossible to de-identify. So what we are building is a fully HIPAA-compliant environment that will support tens of thousands of researchers and hundreds of thousands of studies in time. And the approach it takes, so Stanford is lucky to have a really nice data center located at SLAC, which is the Linear Accelerator Center. And we are partnering with Google Cloud to build this platform. Kubernetes-driven platform will run both the on-premise and the cloud infrastructure. You fundamentally take infrastructure as a service, layer your security around it, make it platform as a service. You take all your tools, layer it under what you would call container as a service, layer your security paradigm around it. So now the researcher fundamentally focuses on doing analysis, and we do have a problem that comes from tool proliferation. If you pick any 100 researchers at Stanford, they are working with at least 100 different tools, even if they're working on imaging. So this is a challenge that we have, but we fundamentally solve it by containerizing once and making it deployable both on cloud and on-premise. And these tools are then available to the entire ecosystem of community of researchers who are using the same tools. The third aspect is how do you actually marry ethics and compliance? And this comes both from the data set, because the data set brings its unique needs. And we have data sets like the claims data sets for the entire US population, Optum, Truven. We have data sets like these, which have their own constraints. But from the single user point of view, they need to be able to see what data sets they have access to, what are the different compliance things that they take HIPAA training courses. All of these things are tracked in one place. So we have partnered with a small company called Redivis, and we have built a platform that allows for the compliance to be managed both for the data set and for the single user, and it's making it available at Stanford scale. So there is one platform where all the Stanford data sets reside, and then researchers access this platform. And because it's a partnership with a small company, this solution will be available to everybody else as well. So I want to just end with basically saying that we work with many industry partners, and if you want to work with us, partner with us, please do. And I'm hiring, so in case you're looking for something exciting to do at Stanford, there's always something exciting going on. Please talk to me. Thank you.